The bowl sat on the third shelf from the bottom, behind the mixing spoons, where it had sat for 11 years. It was small. It was white, with a thin blue line painted around the rim, and a chip on one side the size of a fingernail. My mother had dropped it once, years before she got sick, and instead of throwing it away, she had laughed and said a bowl with a story is worth more than a bowl without one. After she died, I started using it every Sunday morning to mix pancake batter, the same way she used to. It was the only thing of hers I kept in the kitchen where I could see it every day. Our kitchen was small too. The window over the sink looked out at the maple tree in the side yard, and in the morning the light came through the leaves and moved across the counter in soft patches. The fridge hummed in that low, steady way that old fridges do, a sound I had stopped noticing years ago, except late at night when the house was quiet, and it was the only thing I could hear. The counters were yellow tile, a little dated, and the smell in that kitchen was always coffee and butter, and something my mother used to call clean Sunday smell, which was really just dish soap and fresh air from the window cracked open. I was 28 that year, living 40 minutes away in an apartment with a bad radiator, but I came home most Sundays. My father liked it that way. He would call on Saturday night and say, "You coming tomorrow?" And I would say yes, and he would say good, like he had been waiting all week to ask. I was the one who remembered things in our family. I remembered my father's blood pressure medication schedule. I remembered which neighbor had the spare key. I remembered my mother's birthday, which nobody else seemed to remember anymore, not out of cruelty, just because life moves on and people get busy and someone has to be the one who carries the dates around in her head so they don't get lost. That someone was me. It had always been me, even when my mother was alive. I was the daughter who noticed things. My father remarried 4 years after my mother passed. Her name was Carol. She was not a bad person, not in any way you could point to and say, "There, that's the problem." She was pleasant. She brought casseroles to the first few Sunday dinners. She asked about my job at the library and seemed to actually listen to the answer. My father seemed happier than he had been in a long time, lighter somehow, like a weight had come off his shoulders, and I was glad for that. I really was. But there were small things. The first one happened maybe 6 months after the wedding. I came over on a Sunday and noticed the photo of my mother that used to sit on the hallway table was gone. In its place was a photo of Carol and my father at the beach, both of them laughing, both of them tan from a trip to Florida. I asked my father about it casually, just making conversation, and he said, "Oh, Carol thought the hallway could use some updating, and the old photo is probably in a box somewhere, don't worry about it." I didn't say anything. I told myself it was a small thing, houses change. People move pictures around, it didn't mean anything. The second time was a few months after that. I came over for Sunday dinner, and Carol had reorganized the kitchen cabinets while my father was at his Tuesday golf game, which is a strange detail to remember, but I do, because he told me about it like it was a nice surprise she'd given him. She had taken everything out and put it all back in a way that made more sense to her, she said. Things she used more often went to the front. Things she didn't use went to the back, or into boxes for the church donation drive. I opened the cabinet to get a glass and everything was different. The mugs were where the plates used to be. The spice rack had been moved to a drawer. It took me almost a full minute to find a glass, standing there in a kitchen I had grown up in, feeling like a guest in my own childhood home. I didn't say anything that time either. I told myself Carol was just trying to make herself at home, which was fair, because it was her home now too. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself a lot of things that Sunday, standing at the counter with a glass of water I didn't really want, watching Carol move around the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that this space belonged to her now and only her. What I was quietly protecting, without even putting words to it for a long time, was the idea that some part of this house still belonged to my mother. Not in a legal sense. Not in any way anyone could argue with. Just in the sense that a house holds a person's fingerprints for a while after they're gone, in small invisible places, and as long as those places stayed untouched, some part of her was still here. The bowl was still on the third shelf. I checked every Sunday without really meaning to. I would open that cabinet to get the mixing bowl for pancakes, and it would be right there, chipped edge and blue rim, and something in my chest would loosen just a little. That was the thing I was holding onto. I didn't know yet that I was holding onto it. I just knew that as long as it was there, something was still okay. The first real shift happened on a Sunday in March. I came in through the back door, the way I always did, and I could hear Carol on the phone in the living room before I even took my coat off. She had a way of talking on the phone that filled the whole house, not loud exactly, just present, the kind of voice that didn't seem to consider that anyone else might be listening. I'm just saying, she was telling someone, this house has so much potential if people would stop being so sentimental about every little thing. I stood in the kitchen doorway with my coat half off one shoulder. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The fridge hummed behind me. Through the window over the sink, the maple tree branches moved a little in the wind, bare still, because it was early March and spring hadn't come yet. People, she had said. Not me. Not even my name. Just people, like I was a category, like I was a problem to be managed along with old furniture and outdated wallpaper. I hung my coat on the hook by the door, the same hook I'd used my whole life, and I went into the living room and said hi like nothing had happened, because nothing had happened, not really. It was just a sentence. People say things on the phone they don't think anyone hears. I noticed it though. I filed it away. I didn't know what I was filing it away for. I just knew that it went somewhere in me and stayed there, the way a splinter stays under the skin even after you stop feeling it. The second incident was harder to let go of, and it came about 2 months later, in May. My father had a small wooden box in his study on the top shelf of the bookcase where he kept what he called the important papers. Insurance documents, the deed to the house, a copy of his will which he had updated after he remarried, though he had told me more than once in the easy way fathers say things they think are obvious, that the house would go to me eventually, because it had been my mother's house first, in a sense, even though both their names were on it now. He said it like it was settled. Like it didn't need to be written down in any special way, because it was just understood. I went into the study that made to find a stamp, because I needed to mail something and my father always had stamps in his desk drawer. The box was open on the desk, which was unusual because my father was careful about that box. Carol was in the room too, sitting in the armchair by the window with a folder of papers in her lap, and when I came in she closed the folder, not quickly, not suspiciously, just normally, the way anyone closes a folder when someone walks in. Updating some of our information with the lawyer, she said, in a voice that was perfectly pleasant, boring paperwork stuff, you know how it is. I said something like, oh sure, no problem, and I found the stamps and left. But I had seen the corner of one page before she closed the folder, just the corner. It had a date on it, typed in the top right, the way official documents do. May 14th. That year, just 2 days before. I didn't think much of it in that moment. People update paperwork. It's normal. Married couples update their wills, especially after a few years, especially if circumstances change. There was nothing wrong with any of it. But I remembered the date. I don't know why I remembered it so clearly, except that it was the kind of detail that didn't have anywhere to go yet, so it just sat in my mind, waiting. The third incident came at the end of that summer, and this one was harder to explain away, because it touched something that had nothing to do with paperwork or photos or cabinets. It touched the bowl. I came over on a Sunday in late August, the kind of late summer day where the light is gold and heavy and everything smells like cut grass. I went into the kitchen to start the pancake batter, the way I always did, and I opened the cabinet, and the third shelf was empty. Not rearranged, empty. I stood there for a moment with the cabinet door open, looking at the bare wood where the bowl had sat for 11 years, and my chest went tight in a way I wasn't expecting. I told myself it had probably just been moved during another reorganization. I checked the other cabinets. I checked the drawer under the oven where bigger pans went. I checked the shelf above the fridge, even though I had to pull a chair over to reach it. It wasn't anywhere. I found Carol in the laundry room, folding towels, and I asked her, as casually as I could manage, if she had seen the little white mixing bowl, the one with the blue line around the edge. Oh, she said, without looking up from the towels, the chipped one. I put that in tea. He donation box last week. It had a crack in it, sweetheart. It really wasn't safe to use anymore. I didn't think anyone would miss it. Sweetheart, she had never called me that before. It landed strange, like a hand on my shoulder from someone who had never touched me before, too familiar and too late. The donation box, she said, had already gone to the church on Tuesday, 3 days ago. I said it was fine. I said it really was fine, it was just a bowl, and I went back into the kitchen and used a different bowl for the pancake batter, a plain glass one that belonged to no one in particular, and I made the pancakes, and I ate breakfast with my father and Carol at the kitchen table the way I had every Sunday for years, and the whole time there was a sound in my ears like static, low and steady, like the inside of a seashell. That was the day everything changed, even though nothing visible happened. I sat at that table, buttering a pancake I didn't really want, listening to my father talk about his garden, and underneath all of it, calm and still, I understood something. I understood that the bowl was gone, and the photo was gone, and the will had been changed 2 days after a date I happened to glimpse on a folder, and none of these things were proof of anything. Not one of them, on its own, would mean anything to anyone. A bowl can be donated. A photo can be moved. A will can be updated for 100 reasonable reasons. But I had been collecting these things without meaning to. Each small piece had gone somewhere inside me and stayed, quiet, waiting, the way the bowl's chip had waited 11 years for someone to ask about it. I drove home that evening with the windows down because it was still warm and the wind was loud, and I didn't cry, and I didn't call anyone, and I didn't say a single word about it to my father. I just drove, and somewhere around the halfway point, on the long stretch of road that runs along the river, I started to understand what the date on that folder might mean, and what I might need to do about it, and how much time I might have to do it. Not much. That was the feeling that settled into my chest, cold and clear, not much time at all. The next morning, I called the lawyer's office. Not my father's lawyer. My own. A woman named Patricia Ahn, who I had found 2 years earlier when I was writing my own will, the kind of thing you do when you're in your late 20s and someone at work mentions it and you think, I should probably get around to that, and then you do, and then you forget about it. Patricia remembered me. I told her I had a question about something, and could I come in? She said of course, and asked if Thursday worked, and I said Thursday worked. That Thursday, I sat across from her in an office that smelled faintly of coffee and printer paper, and I told her everything. The photo, the folder with the date, the bowl. I told her I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. I told her I just wanted to understand what my position actually was, legally, in case anything had changed that I didn't know about. She listened the way good lawyers listen, without much expression, taking small notes. When I finished, she asked me a question I wasn't expecting. Do you know if the house is still titled the way it was originally? She asked. Or has anything been added to the deed since the remarriage? I said I didn't know, I had never thought to ask. She said it was a simple thing to check. Deeds are public record. She could pull it that afternoon if I wanted. I said yes. She called me back 2 days later, on a Saturday, while I was at the grocery store standing in front of the cereal, and she said, in the same calm voice she'd used in the office, that the deed had been updated about 4 months earlier. My father's name was still on it, but Carol's name had been added as a joint owner with full rights of survivorship, which meant that if my father passed away, the house would go entirely to Carol, automatically, regardless of what his will said. I stood there in the cereal aisle with the phone against my ear, and a woman pushed her cart past me and said, "Excuse me," and I stepped aside without really seeing her. 4 months earlier, around the same time as the folder with the date, around the same time the photo disappeared from the hallway, the pieces I had been quietly carrying for almost 2 years suddenly weren't separate pieces anymore. They were one picture, and the picture had been forming the whole time, slow and patient, while I made pancakes every Sunday and said nothing. I want to be clear about something, because it matters. What was happening was not illegal. My father was alive and competent, and he had signed those papers himself, as far as anyone could prove. Carol had not forged anything, had not stolen anything in any way the law could touch. She had simply, slowly, over 4 years, made herself a permanent fixture in a house that wasn't supposed to be. Permanently hers, in ways that would only become visible after it was too late to undo them. And once I understood that, sitting in my car in the grocery store parking lot with a bag of cereal I didn't remember buying, something in my chest went very still. It wasn't anger, exactly. Anger is loud, and this was the opposite of loud. It was more like the moment right before you step onto ice, when your whole body goes quiet and careful and completely focused, because you know exactly what you're standing on and exactly how much weight it can hold. I thought about my mother. I thought about the bowl, sitting in some donation box, maybe already sold, maybe already broken the rest of the way, maybe sitting on someone else's shelf right now with no idea what it had meant to anyone. And I thought calmly, the time to do something about this is now. Not in anger. Not in a confrontation at the dinner table that would only make my father defensive and make Carol look like the victim of an ungrateful stepdaughter. Just now, quietly, in a way that couldn't be undone later. The first thing I did surprised even me. A little, because it wasn't dramatic at all. I called my father. Not to accuse him, not to tell him what I knew. I called him on a Tuesday evening, the way I sometimes did just to talk, and after we caught up about his garden and his blood pressure numbers, I asked him, in the most casual voice I could manage, whether he and Carol had ever talked about what would happen to the house, long term. Just out of curiosity. Just because I'd been thinking about my own will lately, and it made me think about these things in general. He said, "Oh, Carol and I talked about that a while back. We wanted to make sure everything was simple, no complications, so we put both our names on everything. Keeps it simple for whoever's left," he said. No fighting over paperwork. I said that made sense. I asked, gently, almost like an afterthought, whether he remembered what his will said about the house specifically, the part he'd told me about years ago, about it eventually coming to me. There was a pause, a real one. I could hear him thinking, the way you can hear someone thinking over the phone, a small shift in breathing. He said, I'd have to look at that again. I think Carol's lawyer helped us simplify a few things. I don't actually remember all the details anymore, to be honest. Why, is something wrong? No, I said, nothing's wrong, I was just curious. We talked for a few more minutes about other things, and then we said goodnight. And I sat on my couch afterward in the quiet of my apartment, listening to a car pass outside, and I understood something new. He didn't know, not really. He had signed papers that someone else had prepared, trusting that they reflected what he'd always said he wanted, and he hadn't checked, because why would he? Because he trusted the person handing him the pen. That changed things, because now I knew this wasn't really about a confrontation between me and Carol. It was about giving my father the chance to see clearly, on his own, with his own eyes, what he had actually signed. The second step I took was small, and it took about a week to set up, and it almost didn't work. Patricia explained to me that while she couldn't represent both me and my father, since that would be a conflict, she could refer him to a colleague of hers, a man named Robert Lynn who specialized in estate planning for older adults, specifically the kind of situation where someone wants to make sure their wishes are clearly documented and legally sound, especially after a remarriage. It's a common enough need. People do it all the time, completely normally, with no scandal attached to it at all. So I didn't go to my father with accusations. I went to him with a magazine article. I had found it weeks before, almost by accident, while waiting at the dentist's office. An article in a financial magazine about blended families and estate planning, about how easy it is for original intentions to get lost in paperwork over the years, and how more and more people were getting periodic reviews done, just to make sure everything still matched what they wanted, especially as they got older. I tore the page out, which I never do, and I kept it in my bag for almost 2 weeks before I found the right moment. The right moment came on a Sunday, the first Sunday in October, while Carol was at a hair appointment and my father and I were alone in the kitchen, him reading the paper at the table, me washing the breakfast dishes in the glass bowl that had replaced the old one. I mentioned the article almost as a joke. I said, "This made me think of you. You're always saying you want things simple for whoever's left, and apparently lots of people get a little review done every few years just to make sure everything's still set up the way they think it is." I said it lightly. I said I'd actually thought about doing the same thing myself, now that I had a will of my own. He read the article while I dried the dishes. He didn't say much. But 2 weeks later, he called me and said, almost sheepishly, that he'd made an appointment with someone, just to look things over, no big deal, probably nothing would even change. I said that sounded smart, I didn't ask any more questions, I let it sit. The third step was the hardest, because it required me to wait, and not knowing was its own kind of wait. 3 weeks went by, I didn't hear anything. I went to Sunday dinners as normal. Carol was, if anything, warmer than usual that month, talking about a trip she and my father were planning for the spring, showing me photos on her phone of hotels in a place neither of them had been before. I smiled and looked at the photos and asked normal questions about the trip, and the whole time there was a small cold spot in my stomach, because I didn't know what was happening in that appointment, or whether my father had even gone through with it, or whether, somehow, Carol had found out and smoothed it over before it went anywhere. I had to be careful not to ask. Asking would have meant admitting I knew something, and once I admitted that, everything would shift, and not in the direction I needed it to. So I waited. I went to the library where I worked and shelved books, and helped people find what they were looking for, and went home and made dinner for one and waited. The way you wait for a phone call you've been told might come any day, not knowing if today is the day. The call came on a Wednesday evening, in late October. It was my father. His voice sounded different, not upset exactly, tired, like someone who had just put down something heavy. He said he wanted to tell me something, and he wanted to tell me himself, before anyone else did. He said he'd gone to see the lawyer, the one from the article, just for a routine review like I'd suggested. And during that review, the lawyer had gone through everything, the will, the deed, all of it, and had explained to him, plainly, what each document actually said and what it actually meant. He said he hadn't realized, he said those words twice, I hadn't realized. He said the deed change 4 months ago had given Carol full ownership of the house upon his death, regardless of what the will said, and the will itself had been quietly rewritten to leave the bulk of everything else to Carol as well, with what he called a token amount to me, a phrase that he repeated back to me with something close to shame in his voice. A token amount, like that's what I am to her, a token. He said he had asked Carol about it that evening, calmly, just to understand, and she had told him it was just simplification, just practical, just what made sense for two people building a life together, and that she was sure he had understood at the time, and maybe he had just forgotten the details because he didn't like dealing with paperwork. He said he sat with that for a long moment, and then he had gone back into his study, alone, and pulled out the original will from years ago, the one from before the remarriage, the one that still existed because nothing had ever been formally destroyed, just superseded, and he had read it again for the first time in years. He read me one line from it, over the phone, his voice steady but quiet. The line said that the house, in recognition of everything my mother had built and everything I had been to this family, every single day, without ever asking for anything, was to come to me. Those were close to his original words, written down years ago, in his own hand before a lawyer typed it up properly. He said he didn't know how he had let 4 years of small changes add up to that line meaning nothing. He asked me if I had known, not in an accusing way, just asking. I told him the truth. I told him I had noticed some things, over time, small things, and I hadn't known what they added up to until recently, and I hadn't wanted to say anything because I didn't want to start a fight in his marriage, because I knew he loved Carol, and I still believed, even now, that some of it might have just been carelessness rather than anything worse. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, I think I need some time to think about all of this. And he thanked me, in a strange, formal way, for the article, for the suggestion to get things reviewed, and I said it was nothing, just something I'd read, and we said good night. I hung up the phone and sat on my couch in the dark for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to grief, fresh and unexpected, the kind that comes back around years after you think you've finished feeling it. I thought about my mother again, and the bowl, and I cried for the first time in a long time, not because anything bad had happened, but because something true had finally been said out loud, after so long. The weeks that followed air quiet, the way the most important weeks often are. My father had the deed corrected. It took some paperwork, some signatures, a meeting with the lawyer that he asked me not to attend, because he said it was something he needed to do himself, and I respected that. The will was rewritten again, this time with both him and the lawyer reviewing every line together, slowly, out loud, so there could be no confusion about what anything meant. I don't know everything that was said between him and Carol in those weeks. I know they had a lot of long conversations, some of them late at night, because I would sometimes call in the evening and he would say, "Can I call you back tomorrow? We're in the middle of talking through some things." I never asked for details. It wasn't my conversation to have. What I do know is that by the time Thanksgiving came, things had changed, quietly, in a way that didn't make a sound. Carol was still there, they were still married. But something had shifted between them, something that had less to do with paperwork and more to do with the fact that my father had looked at 4 years of small decisions and seen, for the first time, a pattern, and you cannot unsee a pattern once you've seen it. He was kinder to her in a careful way, but there was a distance now too, a kind of watchfulness that hadn't been there before. Carol, for her part, was quieter around me. She still called me sweetheart sometimes, but it sounded different now, smaller, like a habit she hadn't decided whether to keep. Nobody ever said the word betrayal out loud. Nobody yelled. There was no scene, no dramatic dinner where everything came crashing out. It happened the way most real things happen, in small conversations and quiet appointments and signatures on pages, the same slow, careful way it had been taken apart in the first place. I went to Sunday dinners through the winter, same as always. The kitchen looked the same. The cabinets stayed where Carol had put them, because honestly, after a while, I'd gotten used to where things were, and it didn't seem worth the trouble to move them back. Some things you let go of, because holding on to every small thing isn't the point. The point was never really about cabinets. The point was the bowl. I thought about it often that winter, where it might be, whether it had survived being donated, whether some stranger was using it right now without knowing anything about where it came from. I didn't expect to ever see it again. I made peace with that mostly. A bowl is a small thing in the end, and I had bigger things settled now, things that mattered more even if they were quieter. Then, in March, almost a year to the day after I'd first heard Carol on the phone saying people were too sentimental about things, I was at a flea market 2 towns over, the kind of place I went sometimes on Saturday mornings just to wander, not looking for anything in particular. There was a table near the back with mismatched dishes, the kind of table everyone walks past. I almost walked past it too, but something made me look down, just for a second, and there it was. White, a thin blue line around the rim, a chip on one side the size of a fingernail. I picked it up. My hands were cold from the morning air, and the bowl was cold too, ceramic cold, the way things are when they've been sitting outside on a table for hours. I turned it over. On the bottom, in pencil, someone had written a price: $2. The woman at the table told me it had come from a box of donated kitchen things. Church donation, she thought, from sometime last fall. She said most of it had sold months ago, but a few pieces had just been sitting around since. I paid the $2. I held the bowl the whole walk back to my car, both hands around it, the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping even though it's already survived being dropped once before. It's spring again now, a full year later. I'm sitting in my own kitchen as I write this, in my apartment with the radiator that still doesn't work quite right, and the morning light is coming through my window the same way it used to come through the window over my parents' sink, in soft, moving patches across the counter. The bowl is on my counter, not in a cabinet. On the counter, where I can see it every morning, the way I used to check for it every Sunday without realizing that's what I was doing. I use it every weekend now, for pancakes, the same recipe, the same chip catching the light the same way it always did. My father comes over sometimes on Sundays now, just the two of us, an arrangement that happened slowly and without either of us really deciding it on purpose. Carol doesn't come. Nobody ever said she couldn't. It just turned out that way, the way these things do. My father noticed the bowl the first time he came over. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked, quietly, "Is that?" "Yes," I said. He nodded, and he didn't ask anything else, and we ate breakfast, and the fridge in my apartment hummed in that same low, steady way fridges do, and outside the window the trees were just starting to get their leaves back. The bowl sits on my counter now, where anyone walking into my kitchen would see it first.